This is Man to Men, the premier audio journal for men living faithfully and leading courageously. I'm Jared Musgrove. Every Live Faithfully episode is designed for man-to-men discussion, equipping you and the men in your community to live faithfully with God and one another. We are in the connecting Proverbs. That's what I like to call Proverbs 1 through 9, those chapters of the collection, because this cohesive section is about your capacity for relationships as a man. It is about engaging your heart, something we've been talking about a lot in these episodes. And these chapters in particular, really the entire collection, is a compass for beginning and continuing and sustaining righteousness throughout your life, guys. We are in chapter 5, and it lays out the results of following in the way of Lady Folly, or as I like to call her, a more direct translation, the strange woman. That is, being seduced by her, adopting her crooked ways, succumbing to the counterfeit intimacy and vulnerability in sex outside of marriage, most forthrightly, leading an illicit, impeachable life. Now, we've been talking in these past chapters, the last episodes, that lady wisdom is to be your lifelong love affair, your lifelong model. Marry her, men. Become her, young women. The strange woman, or Lady Folly, we are warned to be aware of her. Be aware of her way. Know how she works and avoid her. Women, do not adopt her way and avoid becoming her. Men, do not have relationship at all with her. So this is a sobering chapter for all of us. We are going to go there. What your body is for, what your heart is not for, how temptation talks to you, and what to do about it. More on all that after this. Do you feel called to ministry? The team at Southeastern Seminary knows that you have a strategic role to play then in fulfilling the Great Commission. That's why they offer the Master of Divinity to provide rigorous biblical and theological training for your current and future ministry. Their Master of Divinity combines broad ministry training with deep biblical study and personal formation, all within a community committed to serving the church and fulfilling the Great Commission. There's never been a better time to pursue a Master of Divinity at Southeastern. So visit sebts.edu/MDIV to learn how your Master of Divinity could be fully funded. We have listeners from across the country here at Man to Men, but I don't assume that every man has heard about or experienced camp ministry. Friend of the show and sponsor Lifeway offers 3 national camps: Fuge, Student Life, and CentraKid. And they are always on the search for strong, capable young men to work camp each summer. Now, these are job opportunities, guys, and they range from leading Bible study and recreation each day to being on production staff. These are the guys who are responsible for running sound, lights, and video for a seamless and smooth worship experience. And since Lifeway camps serve over 100,000 campers every summer, it won't be hard for you to find the job that's just right for you. You can go to the websites linked in the show notes to learn more. I hope that you'll go and apply today. Hey dads, it might be time to break free from distractions and refocus on what matters most, your family. Glorietta Family Camp is a 4 or 6 night adventure made to bring your family closer to God and one another. It's designed for intentional family time with devotionals, adventure activities, and so much more. You can join Family Camp this summer for a most unique family vacation and learn why adventure is the best kind of family bonding. Register today at glorietta.org or by clicking the link in our show notes. Hey fellas, if you're a college student or you know a college student who's ready to make a difference immediately after graduating, well, Reliant Mission, friend of the show and our sponsor, has opportunities for you. They partner with top churches and ministries worldwide like the Austin Stone, Summit Church, and the International Mission Board, just to name a few. They offer incredible 1 to 2 year support-based residencies. And these aren't just any internships, guys. These are opportunities to deeply engage in meaningful ministry while being trained and developed for what God may be calling you to next. You could spend the first or even second year outside of college, growing in your faith, developing tangible skills, all while making a kingdom impact. Whether you're called to serve locally or on global missions, these residencies are your gateway to full-time ministry. If you're interested, you can find out more at reliant.org. That's RELIANT.org. And they'd love to hear your story. You can email the guys directly at partner@reliant.org to set up a time where you can share what God's doing in your life and explore the local and global opportunities that are available to you right now. We're back. Now, Proverbs Chapter 5 particularly talks about the heart of intimacy that lives in every man. There's something loud in the streets. And this time, for this young man sitting with his father, his mentor who's giving him this discourse, who's giving him this insight into what it means to have your heart led astray by romantic love and what your heart is really for, what your body is for, There's something loud in the streets in those times. There's something loud in the streets in our time that's equating the heart with romantic love solely, which in our hypersexualized culture translate immediately into sex acts. It's a dumbing down of our hearts and our bodies, guys, and of real love. It's no way, Derek, that is, it's no direction of life. It is no way of character. It is no capacity for relationships to live in this way. Maybe you already know that by experience. I figure many of us do. Now, these two voices that are crying aloud in the streets, this is not new. As I mentioned, it's been happening since sin entered the world back in Genesis 3. And your father, your mentor in this section, does not want you to set out on your own, to leave the house, to start to build a life on your own, enter those warrior years without knowing this about the world, about who's looking to snare you. Because there are two voices here in Proverbs 5, that of Lady Wisdom and that of the strange woman or Lady Folly. Your father, your mentor wants you to know what both of them sound like before you encounter them fully on your own. Now, that is loving foresight, men. It is one of the great gifts of these first 9 chapters of the Proverbs collection. Who you listen to and the relationships you cultivate in these connecting years, in your teen years, in your early 20s, these set a trajectory for your way once you're set out. Once you have already gone out of your parents' home, you're out on your own, you're running and gunning, building a life. And part of that includes pursuing further relationships, healthy relationships. Your heart, your way, as we've been talking about in Proverbs, is bound up in this. This can be a good thing, but know that your ear plays a part as well. Listen to what the father or the mentor says in these opening lines of Proverbs 5. My son, to my wisdom, hearken, lean in. To my discernment, bend your ear. To guard cunning, and your lips may keep knowledge. The idea here, guys, is that your body posture continues to be locked into what your father mentor's words are to you. In fact, the body is as just as much concern as your heart in this passage, because your good father, this godly mentor, is talking about a warning of being drawn away from your way, the path set for you by God, by illicit sexuality, as much as it is a celebration of the joy of conjugal sex. Yeah, that's what the chapter's about. Your father or your mentor is talking to you explicitly about explicit sex. So for the sake of our souls, we have to get over the red-faced embarrassment pretty quickly. Would that all of us had had such real talk with trusted parents or mentors early on. I've sat pastorally with just too many fellow brothers and men who fell into the very sex traps that Proverbs 5 is warning against early on, and nearly as many young couples who didn't have such conversations before entering into marriage or in those early years of marriage. We need this kind of real talk from the people who love us, because most human sexuality is super complex and it's wrapped up in our hearts. The way we talk about the heart in Proverb, it's wrapped up in our way, our character, how we go through life. The Proverbs collection does not shy away from that. So here's our chance, guys. For most of us, if you're past your 20s, if you're already in the warrior years, or you're already kind of in those later years, and with the capacity to bless or capacity for wisdom, this is our chance to maybe make up for some lost time and some lost lessons if we are already past those connecting years and we haven't walked in a discerning way with our sexual lives, particularly. For those of us who are still in those years, this is a chance to begin to set out in a good way of approaching sexual intimacy. Your full heart, your lave, and your body and your way aligned with God's way, his path. Now, the way begins with a heart attuned to your parent or your mentor's words, inclining your ear to form a plan as they are laying out here in Proverbs 5. This requires discretion and cunning before you set out. Cunning is not negative. Cunning is actually just being wise about the way the world operates. The Proverbs collection is one of the best places in the Bible, saying, this is how the world operates. I want you to be aware of it. That's cunning. That ultimately is wisdom. You don't adopt the world's way, but you know how it works. In this case, we want to know how the strange woman or how lust or how temptation work in the life of the man, how they seethe their way in. This one continuous poem in Proverbs 5 devotes space to elaborating the way of the woman that men should pursue in Lady Wisdom, and that women should emulate, again, Lady Wisdom. She is to be an ideal spouse or a role model. And then there's even more space in this particular chapter about the woman to avoid being or becoming at all cost. The message is, men, don't fall for the strange woman. Women, don't become the strange woman. This strange woman's lips are where it begins. And bless our translators, the idea here is not words from the strange woman in verse 3, where it talks about her lips. It's talking about her kisses and, candidly, much more. Sex is shockingly powerful, men. It's designed by God to encompass your heart, soul, mind, and body. The text describes her lips drip not with godly cunning or wisdom. Her speech is smoother than oil. It draws you in. It is enticing. Men, these kisses, what she does with her mouth. But the text says this does not lead to a fulfilled life. Certainly not an unimpeachable life. Not even a happy life. Certainly not a holy one. So falling in with her or turning into her ends is as bitter, the text says, as wormwood in verse 4, sharp as a double-edged sword in chapter 5, verse 4. And it says this happens every single time. You marry your way with the way of the strange woman. It never works out. So what your father does is he says that you are charged to keep your way. Again, that's our signpost. That's that Hebrew word derek that means keep your character, keep your way of life, keep the way that you navigate through life, keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. That's Proverbs 5, verse 8. Now that's helpful. That's very practical advice. You want to stay out of the strange woman's way. You don't want to adopt her ways or get caught up in that. Don't go near her. Align your lave, your heart's desires with the way you want to go and avoid the ways and pathways walked by the strange woman. Now, here's a story. I don't know if you guys have ever had this happen to you, but I have moved in town before. This was new for me in my adult life. We lived in one house in town, and then we moved about a mile the other way to another house. And so my center of gravity was still the place that I lived, and yet my house had changed. Where my way of life, where my everyday took place, changed. And in the first 2 weeks after we moved into the new place, I found myself on autopilot. I wasn't even thinking about it. You know, you're done with the day, you're driving home, you're on autopilot. And I found myself pulling into the driveway of the old house. And I had to say to myself, I was like, what in the world? I had formed this pathway where when I'm on autopilot, I just tend to go home and pull in that driveway because that's what I did for years. And I had to literally say to myself, I don't live here anymore. This is not my home. And I had to sheepishly back out, hope no one saw me, and I had to drive off to the new home, the place where I do live. So the idea there is to align your heart's desires with the way you want to go. Form new pathways, men, if the old pathways have been aligned with the strange woman. Proverbs 4:23 that we covered last week does say this. It says, guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life. We see more of that heart talk here in chapter 5. Jesus says this in Matthew 12:35. He says, a good person produces good things from the storeroom of good, and an evil person produces evil things from their storeroom of evil. I cannot think of a better way for Jesus to summarize Proverbs chapter 5. That is what's going on here. We have some good presented, opening up with Lady Wisdom, but for the most part, we are getting insight into how the strange woman works in her way. That is the alignment of our heart. That is the actual choice that we make. It's like deciding, I don't live here anymore. I'm going to go a new way. This is my home now. Or we continue to drive to a house that ultimately is going to destroy us when we align our way with the strange woman. It's all one thing in your heart. And what if the strange woman gets in your way? Because that can happen. You can decide, I don't go this way anymore. I don't drive here anymore. I'm following the father mentor's advice to not even go to her house, to avoid the ways of her house. I don't even walk down that path. But a few years ago, I sat with a very successful, godly executive and family man who traveled often. And he took every precaution toward avoiding the roadways and the kisses of the strange woman every time he traveled. Until one time, he showed up at his own hotel room late at night to find his neighbor, a lady, struggling with her own room key. She couldn't seem to get in the door. And he innocently asked, he's like, hey, are you all right? Do you need any help? And she walked over to him and propositioned him directly to take her into his own room that night. Now, he was walking in a good way. And spoiler alert, guys, he did not accept her invitation. But he did share the story with me to say, man, even when you avoid the way to the strange woman's house, she will come find you. That voice that Proverbs 5 talks about is very real. He was walking in a good way. The strange woman cut in on him. That also happens. He shared with us that because someone had talked to him early in his life about this very passage of Proverbs, Proverbs 5, it came to mind in that moment, and he asked her to leave and did not open his door to her. In fact, he walked back to the lobby, guys. He walked out of her way, like her way of life, her derrick, the way that was going to lead to destruction. And he returned again to his room much, much later, not having succumbed to a life-ruining decision of a fleeting heart and body. Now, the story is as your parent or mentor has shared with you in Proverbs 5, 10 through 14. I'm going to read that one for you guys because this is important to what we're setting up and honestly how we're being guided here in this chapter. Lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life, you begin to groan. This is if you have begun to accept the ways of the strange woman, this is what's going to happen. Your flesh and body are consumed, it says at the end of verse 11, verse 12. And you say, how I hated discipline or self-discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or mentors, and I inclined my ear to their instructions. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. That means in the fellowship of believers, falling in with the strange woman, either as a man who gives himself to her or as a woman who adopts her ways, always leads to a loss of resources and work for the Lord. It leads to a loss of health and home. This is what it's talking about in Proverbs 5, 10 through 14. There is a physical deterioration that comes with sexual sin that is unlike others. And this chapter, these verses, particularly 10 through 14, do not shy away from it. There's an emotional distance and a loss of even just good countenance that is often the first sign of you aligning with the strange woman, men. There's a loss of relationships in your life. There's a loss of connection, healthy connection, godly connection to other people. There's a loss of yourself. And it's disappointing. Those who look up to you or whom you mentor yourself. It's saying, even when I stood in the congregation of people, I stood ruined. No one dances with or embodies the strange woman's way and leaves with a whole heart as they had before. The final verse in this passage underlines all of this. Proverbs 5:22. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. But contrasted with falling in love with the strange woman is Lady Wisdom as your lifelong love affair, an example starting in verses 15 through 21. The alternative to the strange woman is sexual intimacy with one spouse in a God-honoring marriage, man and woman. 5:15 says this, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. That is to say, guys, find pleasure and life in a fulfilling marriage. Go home to a fulfilling marriage. Build, cultivate. That's the message. God doesn't promise any of us an amazing sex life. That's not a promise in the Bible. But he does command us that if we are in marriage to remain in that covenant. An amazing sex life is built in a marriage out of covenant relationship, out of communication, out of just commitment to one another. You keep working on it. He does show you in the Proverbs collection that there's a sexual way that does lead to entrapment, to shame, to utter ruin we're seeing here in chapter 5. And the wise man receives and views God's gift of sexual intimacy as a rule of grace, almost like Psalm 16. The boundary lines have fallen in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. Don't take it as rules. It's really freedom for you. And that doesn't mean to shame any one of us if you've already walked out the path of the strange woman. If that's part of your past life, or is that something you're struggling with right now, God loves restoration. Let me read this to you out of the Gospel Primer by a man named Milton Vincent. Highly recommend this book to you guys. It's called A Gospel Primer for Christians. He says this, every time I deliberately disobey a command of God, it is because I am in that moment doubtful as to God's true intentions in giving me that command. Does he really have my best interest at heart? Or is he withholding something from me that I would be better off having? Such questions, whether consciously asked or not, lie underneath every act of disobedience. However, the gospel changes my view of God's commandments in that it helps me to see the heart of the person from whom those commandments are coming. When I begin my train of thought with the gospel, I realize that if God loved me enough to sacrifice his son's life for me, then he must be guided by that same love when he speaks his commandments to me. Viewing God's commands and prohibitions in this light, I can see them for what they really are, friendly signposts from a heavenly Father who is seeking to love me through each direction so that I might experience his very fullness forever. Proverbs Chapter 5 captures the competing voices you will hear for the rest of your life. It's a good father and mentor's most candid discourse on sexual folly and sexual fullness. But it also serves as a summary of how the entire Proverbs collection will continue to present the pathway in this inescapable part of every human life. There are two potential lovers for you men, two potential models of a way to walk. It's a charge to true sexual trust and fullness, and it ends in another signpost in Proverbs 5, verse 21. For a man's ways, or his derrick, his way of life, for a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. There is nothing that you have done or are doing currently that is outside the eyes of the Lord. Human sexuality is made overly complex by our rebellion against God and his way. We're going to talk much more in depth about complexity in a later chapter of the Proverbs collection. But for this moment, in this connecting stage, Proverbs Chapter 5, in this stage of life, it is enough to know, for now, to be able to discern the two competing voices that your father mentor is telling you about that will come to you all the days of your life on this planet and how you can navigate them. Here's some questions for your group together. One, I would tell you men to honestly read, you can do this every week, but especially with Chapter 5, I would read the entirety of Proverbs Chapter 5 out loud together. You might assign, like 5-verse chunks to one another. You may just pick a couple of men or one man to read it through all together, but listen to the scriptures together in this chapter. And then answer these questions. Share around the circle, what alarm bells do you hear in your own heart after hearing these words out of the Proverbs collection? Secondly, what are the benefits of a man who drinks from his own cistern? That's verse 15. Look at that verse. Talk about what it takes to have a strong marriage. How does sexual loyalty in marriage pay off, guys? Have that discussion in your group. Also consider this from Martin Luther. He said this of sexual temptation. You can't do anything about the birds flying over your head, but you can prevent them from building a nest in your hair. How does that metaphor fit your experience with lust and what you've heard in Proverbs 5? With whom have you been having frank discussions about your sexual life? Share that with one another. It's human. It's important. Don't shy away from it. So with whom are you having such frank discussions about the sexual aspects of your life as a man? These are important conversations. That's the challenge of Proverbs Chapter 5, men. Live faithfully. Man to Men is powered by Beta Upsilon Chi, commonly referred to as Bucks. We exist to equip and empower college men to live faithfully and lead courageously. You can find out more about Beta Upsilon Chi by transliterating our Greek letters and adding a .org. That's byx.org. Please subscribe, give us a rating, a comment, and consider giving to our work by following the partner link in our show notes. We are produced, rather well I might add, by the good gentlemen of the Good Podcast Company. For Beta Upsilon Chi, I'm Dr. Jared Musgrove with Man to Men.